And finally, I spoke of her sacrifice, which had meaning in every case. It was in the nature of this sacrifice that it should appear to be pointless in the normal world, the world of material success, but in reality, our sacrifice did have a meaning. Those of us who had any religious faith, I said frankly, could understand without difficulty. I told them of a comrade who, on his arrival in camp, had tried to make a pact with heaven that his suffering and death should save the human being he loved from a painful end. For this man, suffering and death were meaningful. His was a sacrifice of the deepest significance. He did not want to die for nothing. None of us wanted that. The purpose of my words was to find out a full meaning in our life then and there, in that hut and in that practically hopeless situation. I saw that my efforts had been successful when the electric bulb flared up again. I saw the miserable figures of my friends limping toward me to thank me with tears in their eyes. But I have to confess here that only too rarely had I the inner strength to make contact with my companions in suffering, that I must have missed many opportunities for doing so. We now come to the third stage of a prisoner's mental reactions, the psychology of the prisoner after his liberation. But prior to that, we shall consider a question which the psychologist is asked frequently, especially when he has personal knowledge of these matters. What can you tell us about the psychological makeup of the camp guards? How is it possible that men of flesh and blood could treat others as so many prisoners say they have been treated? Having once heard these accounts and having come to believe that these things did happen, one is bound to ask how, psychologically, they could happen. To answer this question without going into great detail, a few things must be pointed out. First, among the guards, there were some sadists, sadists in the purest clinical sense. Second, these sadists were always selected when a really severe detachment of guards was needed. There was a great joy at our work site when we had permission to warm ourselves for a few minutes after 2 hours of work in the bitter frost, in front of a little stove which was fed with twigs and scraps of wood. But there were always some foemen who found a great pleasure in taking this comfort from us. How clearly their faces reflected this pleasure when they not only forbade us to stand there, but turned over the stove and dumped its lovely fire into the snow. When the SS took a dislike to a person, there was always some special man in their ranks known to have a passion for, and to be highly specialized in sadistic torture, to whom the unfortunate prisoner was sent. Third, the feelings of the majority of the guards had been dulled in the number of years in which, in ever increasing doses, they had witnessed the brutal methods of the camp. These morally and mentally hardened men at least refused to take active part in sadistic measures, but they did not prevent others from carrying them out. Fourth, it must be stated that even amongst the guards there were some who took pity on us. I shall only mention the commander of the camp from which I was liberated. It was found after the liberation only the camp doctor, a prisoner himself, had known of it previously, that this man had paid no small sum of money from his own pocket in order to purchase medicines for his prisoners from the nearest market town. But the senior camp warden, a prisoner himself, was harder than any of the SS guards. He beat the other prisoners at every slightest opportunity, while the camp commander, to my knowledge, never once lifted his hand against any of us. It is apparent that the mere knowledge that a man was either a camp guard or a prisoner tells us almost nothing. Human kindness can be found in all groups, even those which as a whole it would be easy to condemn. The boundaries between groups overlapped, and we must not try to simplify matters by saying that these men were angels and those were devils. Certainly, it was a considerable achievement for a guard or foreman to be kind to the prisoners in spite of all the camp's influences. And on the other hand, the baseness of a prisoner who treated his own companions badly was exceptionally contemptible. Obviously, the prisoners found the lack of character in such men especially upsetting. While they were profoundly moved by the smallest kindness received from any of the guards, I remember how one day a foreman secretly gave me a piece of bread which I knew he must have saved from his breakfast ration. It was far more than the small piece of bread which moved me to tears at that time. It was the human something which this man also gave me, the word and look which accompanied the gift. From all this, we may learn that there are two races of men in this world, but only these two, the race of the decent men and the race of the indecent man, both are found everywhere. They penetrate into all groups of society. No group consists entirely of decent or indecent people. In this sense, no group is of pure race, and therefore one occasionally found a decent fellow among the camp guards. Life in a concentration camp tore open the human soul and exposed its depths. It is surprising that in those depths we again found only human qualities which, in their very nature, were a mixture of good and evil. The rift dividing good from evil, which goes through all human beings, reaches into the lowest depths and becomes apparent even on the bottom of abyss, and which is laid open by the concentration camp. And now to the last chapter in the psychology of a concentration camp, the psychology of the prisoner who has been released. In describing the experiences of liberation, which naturally must be personal, we shall pick up the threads of that part of our narrative which told of the morning when the white flag was hoisted above the camp gates after days of high tension. This state of inner suspense was followed by total relaxation, but it would be quite wrong to think that we went, we went mad with joy. What then did happen? With tired steps, we prisoners dragged ourselves to the camp gates. Timidly, we looked around and glanced at each other questioningly. Then we ventured a few steps out of camp. This time, no orders were shouted at us, nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or kick. Oh no, this time the guards offered us cigarettes. We hardly recognized them at first. They had hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road leading from the camp. Soon our legs hurt and threatened to buckle, but we limped on. We wanted to see the camp's surroundings for the first time with the eyes of free men. Freedom, we repeated to ourselves, and yet we could not grasp it. We had said this word so often during all the years we dreamt about it that it had lost its meaning. Its reality did not penetrate into our consciousness. We could not grasp the fact that freedom was ours. We came to meadows full of flowers. We saw and realized that they were there, but we had no feelings about them. The first spark of joy came when we saw a rooster with a tail of multicolored feathers, but it remained only a spark. We did not yet belong to this world. In the evening, when we all met again in our hut, one said secretly to the other, "Tell me, were you pleased today?" And the other replied, feeling ashamed as he did not know that we all felt similarly. Truthfully, no. We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly. Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. How often in the past years had we been deceived by our dreams? We dreamt that the day of liberation had come, that we had been set free, had returned home, greeted our friends, embraced our wives, sat down at the table, and started to tell of all the things we had gone through, even of how we had often seen the day of liberation in our dreams. And then a whistle shrilled in our ears, the signal to get up, and our dreams of freedom came to an end. And now the dream had come true. But could we truly believe in it? The body has fewer inhibitions than the mind. It made good use of the new freedom from the first moment on. It began to eat ravenously for hours and days, even half the night. It is amazing what quantities one can eat. And when one of the prisoners was invited out by a friendly farmer in the neighborhood, he ate and then drank coffee, which loosened his tongue, and then he began to talk, often for hours. The pressure which had been on his mind for years was released at least. Hearing him talk, one got the impression that he had to talk, and that his desire to speak was irresistible. I have known people who have been under heavy pressure only for a short time, for example, through a cross examination by the Gestapo, to have similar reactions. Many days passed until not only the tongue was loosened, but something within oneself as well. Then the feeling suddenly broke through the stage fetters which had restrained it. One day, a few days after the liberation, I walked through the country past flowering meadows for miles and miles toward the market town near the camp. Larks rose to the sky, and I could hear the joyous song. There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing to be but the white earth, and sky and the lark's jubilation and the freedom of space. I stopped, looked around and up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. At that moment, there was very little I knew of myself of the world. I had but one sentence in my mind, always the same. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and He answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and I repeated this sentence, memory can no longer recall. But I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step for step, I progressed until I again became a human being. The way that led from the acute mental tension of the last days in the camp, from that war of nerves to mental peace, was certainly not free from obstacles. It would be an error to think that a liberated prisoner was not in need of spiritual care anymore. We have to consider that a man who has been under such enormous mental pressure for such a long time is naturally in some danger after his liberation, especially since the pressure was released quite suddenly. This danger, in the sense of psychological hygiene, is the psychological counterpart of the bends, just as the physical health of the Kaizen worker could be endangered if he left his driver's chamber suddenly, where he is under enormous atmospheric pressure. So the man who has suddenly been liberated from mental pressure can suffer damage to his moral and spiritual health. During this psychological phase, one observed that people with natures of a more primitive kind would not escape the influences of the brutality which had surrounded them in camp life. Now, being free, they thought they could use their freedom licentiously and ruthlessly. The only thing that had changed for them was that they were now the oppressors instead of the oppressed. They became the instigators, not objects of willful force and injustice. They justified their behavior by their own terrible experiences. This was often revealed in apparently insignificant events. A friend was walking across a field with me toward the camp when suddenly we came to a field of green crops. Automatically, I avoided it, but he drew his arm through mine and dragged me through it. I stammered something about not treading down the young crops. He became annoyed and gave me an angry look and shouted, "You don't say! And hasn't enough been taken from us? My wife and our child has been gassed, not to mention everything else. And you would forbid me to tread on a few stalks of oats?" Only slowly could these men be guided back to the commonplace truth that no one has the right to be wrong, not even if wrong has been done to them. We had to strive to lead them back to this truth, or the consequences would have been much worse than the loss of a few thousand stalks of oats. I can still see the prisoner who rolled up his shirt sleeves, thrust his right hand under my nose, and shouted, "May this hand be cut off if I don't stain it with blood on the day when get home." I want to emphasize that the man who said these words was not a bad fellow. He had been the best of comrades in camp and afterwards. Apart from the moral deformity resulting from the sudden release of mental pressure, there were two other fundamental experiences which threatened to damage the character of the liberated prisoner: bitterness and disillusionment when he returned to his former life. Bitterness was caused by a number of things he came up against in his former hometown. When on his return a man found that in many places he was met only with a shrug of the shoulders and with hackneyed phrases, he tended to become bitter and to ask himself why he had gone through all that he had. When he heard the same phrases nearly everywhere, we did not know about it, and we too have suffered. Then he asked himself, have they really nothing better to say to me? The experience of disillusionment is different. Here it was not one's fellow man, whose superficiality and lack of feeling was so disgusting that one finally felt like creeping into a hole and neither hearing nor seeing human beings anymore. But fate itself, which seemed so cruel, a man who for years had thought he had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, now found that suffering has no limits and that he could suffer still more and still more intensely. When we spoke about attempts to give a man in camp mental courage, we said that he had to be shown something to look forward to in the future. He had to be reminded that life still waited for him, that a human being waited for his return. But after liberation, there were some men who found that no one awaited them. Woe to him who found that the person whose memory alone had given him courage in camp did not exist anymore. Woe to him who, when the day of his dreams finally came, found it too different from all he had longed for. Perhaps he boarded a trolley, traveled out to the home which he had seen for years in his mind, and only in his mind, and pressed to the bell, just as he has longed to do in the thousands of dreams, only to find that the person who should open the door was not there and would never be there again. We all said to each other in camp that there could be no earthly happiness which could compensate for all we had suffered. We were not hoping for happiness. It was not that which gave us courage and gave meaning to our suffering, our sacrifices, and our dying, and yet we were not prepared for happiness. This disillusionment which awaited not a small number of prisoners was an experience which these men have found very hard to get over, and which for a psychiatrist is also very difficult to help them overcome. But this must not be a discouragement to him. On the contrary, it should provide an added stimulus. But for every one of the liberated prisoners, the day comes when, looking back on his camp experiences, he can no longer understand how he endured it all. As the day of his liberation eventually came, when everything seemed to him like a beautiful dream, so also the day comes when all his camp experiences seem to him nothing but a nightmare, the crowning experience of all, for the homecoming. Man is the wonderful feeling that after all he has suffered, there is nothing he needed fear anymore except his God.